as an investor, you're an agent of change, you're a challenge, you can be a cheerleader, but you're not making it happen in that business.
As the change over time perhaps lent itself to bigger deals, did you feel like the way you approach doing those deals, or what makes something a good deal or a bad deal, did that change?
One of my first site visits, it was a casting plant in the middle of nowhere, metal casting, and I showed up in heels, and the heels duly melted in the factory, and then I had to climb up various metal staircases sounding like Long John Silver.
I do think the way you describe yourselves is different, is differentiated, and I don't always think that.
And so I got the call last summer that basically said, look, it's now or never. I'd love you to come and run it with me and Rich.
Welcome to Life of a Dealmaker, the Mayer Brown private equity podcast, in which we talk to senior members of the private equity community about their career highlights, lowlights, investment thesis, and everything in between. We hope you enjoy it. On episode 1, I started by asking my guest to take me to the pinnacle of his career as a window into the full story. With you, what I'd like to do is go in a chronological order. So I want to start at, actually, technically pre-career, PP Oxford. When I was applying for universities, it's
not some bitter story, is it?
No, it's not. Although I didn't get into Oxford, so yeah. So let's get that out of the way early. PP Oxford was definitely what career centres would tell you up and down the country is the holy grail. You go and do PP Oxford, you then get to go and choose whatever you like to do. Did the course for you, did it live up to that billing?
PPE for me is the ultimate degree to sound really good at dinner parties, because you can talk about anything but not with any depth. So I do sound good when I talk about certain issues, but don't dig much deeper. I also dropped the philosophy part very quickly because it just went over my head, and I did mainly economics. So did it open all the doors? Not really, in the sense that particularly at Oxford, it wasn't very mathematical or statistical. Economics is fairly superficial. So I've used a little bit of it going forward.
So your first job, pre-Carlyle, was there a venture capital job?
Actually, it was 2 years at Merrill Lynch, which is now Bank of America. That brand has all but died, sadly, but I will still refer to it 25 years on as Merrill Lynch. I joined the emerging markets team. It was like the Wild West at the time. We covered everything from M&A to equity to debt. When I joined, half the team left. I tried not to take that personally, but it was the Russian debt crisis and they just got rid of a big chunk of the team. And so all that was left was the very junior people and the very senior people. So that was a really good learning ground for just getting pushed into responsibility well ahead of being ready to take it on.
Yeah. And Carlyle followed relatively shortly after.
So I tried to quit banking after the first year. Then they told me to take Sunday to think about it, and which said everything that was wrong with working investment banking at the time.
Yeah.
And so after 2 years of not seeing daylight, I thought maybe this is the time to move on. It was a very aggressive environment. I didn't like who I'd become, frankly. And then at the time, you had the dot-com boom happening. So this was 98, 99, back when we thought Amazon was this strange idea. How little I knew. And so I tried my hand for a year at venture capital. I loved the buy side, but I wanted more structure. Certainly because the business that you were coming across at the time was genuinely a piece of paper with a 3-line business plan on it and dreams of IPOing for billions. And so I really liked the buy side, but this venture malarkey is a little bit too pie in the sky for my liking. And so I joined Carlyle May 2001.
Yeah.
I was incredibly fortunate with the bosses I had. I think there was a quote recently from Jack Ma, choose your first job according to having a good boss, not necessarily what firm you're working for. And I was really lucky with the two I had. And so it was no looking back from there, but incredibly hard work for 18 years.
And so Carlyle now, as Carlyle is today, that would be within the range of options within private equity, obviously asset manager, not just private equity, but it's a very specific type of career choice if you were making it today. Is that translatable to what the choice was that you were making at the time? Carlyle was still relatively young when you were moving in.
I think at the time, PE was a lot less mature than it is today. And at the time, leverage buyouts was the main flavor. You weren't as aware of all the different options. It's become so much more diversified now than it was back then. And so it was one of those growing global brand names. They had a small team in London, but amazing connectivity globally. I interviewed with a number of other PE firms, but it was the personality fit at the end of the day, because at the time you couldn't really differentiate outside in how different the personalities were.
Yeah.
But over time, you saw that, what Carlyle was trying to do and has, I think, successfully done is become one of the premier institutions in the private equity space rather than some other firms which took a different direction. It was much more of still a boutique atmosphere. It was still very founder-driven rather than become more structured and corporate.
Yeah. And when you talk about, you referred to your first job, the banking job, you said that you started to dislike what you were becoming. What does that mean? And how was that corrected with the career decision that you took at that time to go into Carlyle?
I think it was just a very aggressive atmosphere. And so you're just constantly kind of highly strung.
Yeah.
And, I tend to like being a nice person in work and outside of work. And I like people being nice to me and treating me, as I'd like to be treated. And so that's the thing I think has changed massively. People have recognized the importance of culture since then. Back then it was a slightly different era. You were under different time pressures. If you got out the office before 4 a.m, you were doing really well.
Yeah.
That's moved on massively. And so with private equity, it's a slightly different slant, particularly compared to what I was doing then, in terms of there's so much more called upon in terms of your personal skills, your relationship skills. You're genuinely selling yourself as a person, not just as a firm. It's much more around, working in partnership over a longer time period, and therefore there has to be that personal connection.
Yeah, and so that career, that chapter of your career at Carlyle was a very, very long time. I think it's hard probably for you to summarize it in a pithy way, but how do you reflect on that phase and how it progressed and how it changed? And
I think it was a tale of two halves. Certainly the main differentiator being two things: size, a firm and deals that we were doing, as well as pre-IPO, post-IPO.
Yeah.
I think the first 10 years, we were still developing as a firm. Buyouts came in all shapes and sizes, and I got to work on extraordinary, interesting and complicated deals. I carried that straight through the 18 years. So I did take privates, I did carve-outs, all the complicated ones that were multi-time zones somehow ended up on my desk, as my luck would have it. And then as we got bigger in size, you had a lot more diversification in terms of strategies. And there is more sort of corporate infrastructure to rely on. The economics data that Carlyle can generate is unbelievable across its massive portfolio. If you had a question around Taiwanese tax in some esoteric sector, there was someone you could call. Yeah. It was incredible. And so I'd say, it was two key phases towards the back end. My last deal at Carlyle, we closed in March 19. That was a 10 billion EV deal. My first deal at Carlyle was 120 million EV.
Yeah.
So we'd come a heck of a long way in terms of how we worked together between teams. So a big move was relatively regionally siloed. Over time, became brilliant at working globally. And a lot of my latter deals, I was lucky enough to work with the American team there. And it was pretty seamless, actually, in the way we did it.
It sounds like you always had a bit of diversity and range to your role, even as you were from the beginning all the way to the end. But in terms of as the change over time perhaps lent itself to bigger deals, did you feel like the way you approach doing those deals, or what makes something a good deal or a bad deal, did that change, or was that fundamental culture still there, whether it was a 120 million or a X billion?
Fundamentally, the stress maybe goes up with the zeros as well.
Yeah.
In the sense of, I feel very, it's very much that kind of size of deal. It's sitting on your shoulders, and you do the same amount of diligence, regardless of size.
Yeah.
You're as hands-on. You might have the benefit of bigger deal teams, but not much bigger deal teams. And you've got to apply absolutely the same rigor to regardless of size. I think the complexity does multiply. So if I look at the last deal, that was 21 business units. And you've got all sorts of carve-out complexity, but you get the same in small deals as well. So I think the approach and the the sorts of deals you like doing doesn't really change, because it's very much where you cut your teeth, what you learn, and what you have an instinct for. And I always say to people, with private equity, a lot of us receive 90% of the same information. It's our instincts that translate it differently and how we react to it. And that's how we then come out with value, business plan, what we're willing to underwrite.
Yeah. And so at the point, because it sounds like it's a very happy phase of your career, Carlyle, you're obviously there a long time. At the point at which you then thought, okay, now is the juncture at which I've got to look outside or at something else. How did that come about, and what was it that you were trying to fill?
Yeah, it was three things. One, it was 18 years is a long time.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh my gosh, I sound like that boring person going, well, we tried that 10 years ago. And so I was really worried about becoming part of the furniture.
Yeah.
The second is I had done primary buyouts. That last carve-out was my fourth one in the chemical sector, with a business starting with the letter A. So it was starting to get a little bit samey to some degree. And then the third aspect was I really enjoyed developing, teams, working with the team, seeing people, get promoted, all of that. I did start getting involved a little bit more on the HR side on the Carlyle. In the Carlyle group, I was part of the promotions committee and changed the process. Really enjoyed that. Loved the training bit as well. And also being conscious that at the end of the day, the head office was in the US. A lot of that kind of action happened in the US. So I was looking for three things. One is, an instinct to be, masochistic, I suppose, but I've done a certain thing for 18 years. Let's look at the polar opposite in a way and see if there's, a way to broaden my skill set. It was also a feeling that, when you see certain deals come back the third or fourth time, there's a different solution to just the classic primary buyout. There's a different way to structure the capital for the deal to make sense, create a good return. And I thought the ICG product was really interesting in that regard. It's basically addressing that more mature side of the market to some degree, as well as certain deals where, from a size perspective or the structure that was being asked for, again, didn't fit within the European buyout mold, but actually could be addressed by more hybrid capital. So there was the chance to kind of work for somewhere that was UK headquartered, was on its growth journey, a chance to work with somewhere where the team was still forming. There was a chance to have a bit more input on the kind of team development side of things, and also a very different product in terms of what ICG was doing. So I really didn't want to do the same thing again. And so I looked at the polar opposite and thought, who's coming up and doing something quite different? And ICG had a great platform in that regard, and a great team. And there was a chance to get involved with, beyond the UK, the Nordics, and then latterly the Benelux, and then learned a heck of a lot around more structured deals, which is a very different skill set in some ways.
And because that mindset, for someone of your seniority when you were leaving Carlyle, that mindset of, I now want to go in, okay, you've got the thought, I want to do something different, I don't want to be part of the furniture, but going from there to what I'm going to do with that thought is extrapolate it out into going and doing the absolute opposite. Yeah. That's weird, isn't it? It was confident and risk-taking.
Yeah. But it was important. It's kind of reinvigorating your skill set. And I thought, it's a risk, but I sort of backed myself to get up the learning curve fairly quickly. There were lots of, obviously, resonances with what I'd been doing before, so it wasn't completely different.
Yeah.
And I could have an impact, a genuine, different way of thinking, different set of experiences, different actually set of network and connections than what the incumbent team had there. So it was great fun, that feeling when people are like, oh, actually, we haven't talked to these people before, and we've never looked at that sector, or, oh, wow, you have a network base there. So that felt really good.
And you were in the Mezzanine and Equity Opportunities Fund at ICG. Obviously, ICG are very well known for kind of hybrid debt equity strategies. Do you think you changed as an investor? I mean, you might tell me there wasn't actually that much difference in terms of the types of investments you looked at, but do you think anything changed in you fundamentally as an investor in terms of how you apportioned relative importance to upside and downside because of the fact that you went to a firm very well known for hybrid? Absolutely.
I think the way you look at upside versus downside protection when you come from a debt mentality is very different from how you look at it from an equity mentality. And it's the same with how you look at, say, carve-out risk. For some people, that sounds horrendous. And for me, it's like, great, it's opportunity. That's where I've seen some great returns being generated. But it absolutely rounded out my investment perspective in terms of looking at downside risk, really thinking long range as to everything you could think of that could go wrong, try and see if you can stress test the asset in that regard. It gave me a different outlook again on management, because a big difference between a lot of the primary buyouts we were doing, you're often inheriting a situation where you had to bring in new management because you're inheriting a division where maybe the incumbent team was staying with the parent. In the more hybrid capital world, it's a lot more about partnering with management, backing them, and therefore making that judgment around, they've been winners thus far. Are they going to be winners going forward? And so you start getting much more into what motivates them. And it's never just the economics. Of course it isn't. You've got to look at what actually drives them individually as people. Yeah. And so it certainly rounded the skill set in that regard.
So it worked. The idea to test yourself in the opposite way to how you'd been, it worked because it was value accretive in the sense of you feel there was a skill set that was gained there from that move, which is great. I think this is a good time actually to bring in. So this is the rollover question from the last podcast guest, because it's about management. So I obviously know what this question is. You don't. So this is a question from Richard Tudor, co-founding partner of Earner Capital, who's my guest on episode 1. How do you change management whilst maintaining your market credibility for subsequent transactions?
I think with everything, you measure twice, cut once. And I think with changing management, you think very hard about the decision, but don't take too long. Because every time you've made the decision to change management, it's always actually was the right thing to do. And you always kick yourself for maybe I could have done it sooner. Having said that, in terms of management teams where you are genuinely backing them and hoping the relationship's going to work out, it's all about open communication. And so I don't think you can do one and say, well, that means you can never change management. Deals, market situations, contexts change, and you've got to be dynamic with it. And some people make the cut. I think Bill Conway used to say a great thing about, good time CEOs, bad time CEOs, in terms of some people are suited for certain contexts, where market environments, competitive environments, or they just get tired. They're human at the end of the day. A buyout is a marathon. It takes it all out of you, and particularly for that top team, it's very 24/7 for them. So you're very mindful of where they are in that personal cycle. So I think from a credibility standpoint, it's about that open communication. And if you feel that that's the people you're backing, you're very strong. You align incentives that way. But you've got to keep watch throughout the course of the deal. You are the steward of, your and other people's money in every deal that you do, and you've got to stay on point. And every board meeting is that point. Every touch point is that juncture to which to assess, okay, have we still got the right team, the right organization, the right setup to face what we're facing?
We'll come back to talk about Sullivan Street in detail, but just as that comes up, so one thing which stuck out for me when we first met was that Sullivan Street has some rooms allocated for management of the portfolio company. So what's the thinking behind that? Is it to foster or better create that open and regular dialogue that you referred to there?
Exactly. I mean, we talk about ourselves as being kind of operationally minded investors and investment minded operators. So we're not professing to run a business, but we believe that we are, value add where we can interact. We're very much in the trenches with our management team and trying to be supportive on a day-to-day or whatever cadence that suits them basis. And so when we set up our offices, having that extra floor where people can come to convene, whether they're working from home but actually would rather meet centrally, it's a chance to have more touch points within the organization. It's a chance for making sure people are seeing each other in person, not just doing everything on Teams, because it can be quite isolating.
Yeah.
And it's also to feel like they're part of the family, they're part of the firmament. And so we have monthly socials, people from various parts of our management team show up, and it could be divisional folks, it could be senior folks, and it's just really nice because it gives you just a sense of the pulse of the business that you're involved in, and they get to see that you're interested to know what's going on. Which we are. Of course, we're super engaged in what they're doing.
So to finish your story, so we've got to ICG. How was the decision made? How did you think that, okay, I've been at ICG now you're at 3 years. Now I want something different. And how did that lead you into Sullivan Street?
So Sullivan Street was founded by Leighton Tamberlin and Rich Sanders, who've known each other for yonks since university. But I met Leighton when I was at Merrill Lynch. We were in the trainee program together. So that was 25 years ago. And then we trained the next generation, rightly or wrongly, about 2 years into being at Merrill. He did it on roller skates somehow, and I did it, sort of very much more in a pedestrian fashion, but we were absolute, strong friends even back then. And then he founded it with Rich in 2010 and tried to convince me to join. At that point, it wasn't the right time for a whole host of career and personal reasons, etc. And we basically stayed in touch all the time. How's it going? What are you up to? Where can I help, etc. And so I got the call last summer that basically said, look, it's now or never. I'd love you to come and run it with me and Rich.
Why was it now or never?
We were just on that momentum point as a firm. We'd just done our 8th deal. The size of deals had had increased. The number of opportunities we were seeing had increased. Our LPs were keen that we do bigger and more. And so there was a real kind of watershed moment, it felt. And the team had evolved, and there's a brilliant set of juniors that we had in there. And so it had a real momentum. And it was a chance to make an imprint on a firm in terms of building a business. I'd always looked at management teams in awe and said, wow, I wish I could turn around and say, hey, I helped build a business, or I helped make that pivot happen.
Yeah.
As an investor, you're an agent of change, you're a challenge, you can be a cheerleader, but you're not making it happen in that business. You can make it happen to a small degree. You're a cog in a wheel, you're a cog in the machinery of the fund that you work for to some degree. And you evolve your own teams, but it's not that same level of impact. And so I was like, I wish I could have that chance. And so this is my chance. And that doesn't come by very often. And a chance to work with friends and people you absolutely trust who are wired similarly in some regards, but also actually have very complementary skills in terms of what we bring to the table. So I was like, do not pass down this opportunity. This is a really unique experience, and it doesn't happen that often. And so while it was a real wrench to go, gosh, I hadn't thought it would just be 3 years at ICG, I also had to go, well, what am I most passionate about? I do love more operationally involved deals. I liked my life difficult for myself. The idea of working in a small team and having an impact and having that managerial side in terms of evolving the people. And then going back to old school private equity was just really exciting. If I think back to that first phase of my Carlyle career, it was a chance to revisit that. And again, when you're doing those smaller deals and you're a control investor from a governance standpoint, that's where you make real impact. As the deals get a lot bigger, management teams are a lot more established, you have an impact at the board, but not to the same degree. And then when you're doing more hybrid capital, it's again lower impact. So that was that in a nutshell. And so it was a bit of a wrench. My gosh, it's only been 3 years, but at the same time, it was a pretty unique opportunity.
I think it's really interesting that you referred to the point at which you used to explain yours and Leighton's relationship is when you were training people together at Merrill Lynch, which was more than 2 decades ago, right? Sorry to
yeah, thanks for making me old.
And obviously now the decision you took to then effectively go into business together, co-managing partners along with Richard, was many, many years later. So do you think it's fair to say that even at that point, at that early stage, you saw within each other or you saw within Leighton something which was yin and yang effectively, or where your skill sets were different but same enough as you described it to then go and achieve something together? Do you think you knew even back then?
I wouldn't credit myself with prescience. I think what you'd say is with a lot of your friends, they express a certain side of you. They're a more extreme part of who you are in terms of a facet of your own personality. And so there's certainly that complementarity between myself and Leighton, and same with Rich. There is a processy, more structured side of me, and Rich has that in spades. There's a more, instinctive side of me in terms of what Leighton has brilliant instinct, brilliant intuition. And so that's complementary in terms of an investment skill. And then in terms of friendships, it's the same. There's certain elements of how you balance each other out when you're together. So I definitely saw it as there's a trust factor, there's an integrity factor, there's looking at the world in similar ways, reacting to things in certain ways, but also having skill sets where I'm like, I'm good at this thus far, but I can see you're way better than that, way better in that aspect, so on and so forth. So there's a lot there. And so, 25 years on, you're right, maybe I just took a long time to come around to that decision, but certainly no regrets there.
You've mentioned trust a couple of times in the last few minutes, something which is also really important to me. But do you think that has there ever been anything in your career which has been the opposite, which has led you to think that actually trust now within the workplace is even more important to me than it might have been because I've had X experience or Y experience?
Look, every firm has its politics. Every deal has its politics, right? And so one of the attractions in terms of, again, being part of a smaller firm where you get to mold the culture a little bit in your own image, what you'd like to see is, I'm first and foremost, no politics, no one-upsmanship. Everyone supports each other. We complement each other. And no one's trying to be the smartest person in the room. At the end of the day, it's genuine teamwork. And I have a slightly Pollyanna belief that, we're all here to make the pie bigger, rather than fight over how big each person slices. And in the end, the size of the slices will work out. But if we all muck in, then we'll have a better collective result. And so, everyone talks about teamwork and the like, but I'm an avid believer of not having this sort of hero culture or one where you're trying to get one over someone else by, massaging the narrative or what have you. And so from a trust standpoint, it's hard to say I've had periods. It's not about lack of trust. It's just more how to upward manage or manage the politics. I'm just not very good at that. I'm just a plain, walk through the front door, tell you what I'm thinking, and be very honest about everything I'm seeing in terms of the deal or my perspectives on a deal, etc. Because I think that's the best way to be, personally.
Yeah. So Sullivan Street now. Where are you at today, and where are you going?
So we are. We have 5 companies in our portfolio. We're 10 people. We have a great, touchwood, great pipeline in terms of things that we're doing. We focus on equity checks between 20 to 50 million pounds. We're UK-based deals, but looking at international as well as more domestic-based businesses. We're sector agnostic, apart from software, which I kind of leave to the experts, frankly. And it's all around looking at opportunities that have an element of complexity, seeing through the fog of war, so to speak, whether it's operational improvement opportunity, whether it's complexity from an ownership basis, whether it's a carve out or there's a set of stakeholders with different goals. It could be in a sector that may be facing temporary headwinds that you have to work your way through. The whole model is really putting operations at the heart of the decision making, have it in the room when you're absorbing the diligence and making the decision as to where this business can go, where you can add value, what's the value creation plan, and do you have the team to execute it? Where do you need to supplement them? And being quite personal about it, being very human about it, and treating people as you'd like to be treated in terms of across the workforce from the coalface up. So we do look at the less plain vanilla and slightly more off the beaten track type deals. We'll look at things that are a bit more stressed or things where you need to unpick the story a bit or see through the numbers.
Yeah. There are a few parts of the website that I jotted down because I do think the way you describe yourselves is different, is differentiated, and I don't always think that.
There is sort of private equity bingo, isn't there? It's always the same 5 words. So
and hard. Whenever I go and meet a private equity firm for the first time, and I try to do the outside in diligence of the website, there's 80% of the terminology is the same, but I did want to pick out a few things which I think are definitely different and ask you to explain what.
Oh God, he's done his homework. Okay.
Okay, so the first one was on the front page. You described yourself as a conviction-led investor. What does that mean to you? So
for us, that means that we're not waiting for a market or commercial diligence report that says this will be the growth of this business. Sometimes because of the way the numbers are presented, or because of the sector the business is in, or certain challenges, you've just got to take a view. And we pride ourselves on being able to price risk and look at the different outcomes that could happen on a deal regardless of what the macro does. And so what are the opportunities to take a good business, make it better, or take a business that needs help and get it to a good footing? So that does take conviction, and that's, borrowing upon our respective experiences rather than having it spelt out in front of us.
Next one is contrarian. You describe this as contrarian.
Yeah, so sometimes it'll be sectors are a little bit out of favor, or things that a credit committee will say, "Oh, are you kidding me?" So, whereas they'll say, "Wait a minute, are there actual mitigating factors at a micro level, or here's the counter in terms of the opportunity for this business to flourish?"
Yeah, and you seem very busy at the moment. Is that part of the contrary? In obviously the macroeconomic climate is challenging at the moment. Not everybody is meaningfully trying to deploy capital. There might be people out there in the market looking at deals, but maybe not with that, to use the phrase, conviction. You guys are busy at the moment. Is that part of what you see as your contrariness, that now is the time?
I think it's less trying to call the market and saying, "I will have a contrarian view." It's much more about, this is when the complicated situations come out, where some of the businesses are struggling. It's really hard to forecast. They're experiencing destocking, or they've had certain issues to contend with. Or in some cases, you've had founder transitions. Now, for some people, they'll be like, "Gosh, I don't want to go into something where the founder's stepping away." We'll say, "Okay, if it makes sense and we can get our heads around what it will take to get the business to stand on its own 2 feet post-founder, for example, or if it's a sector that's going to have a tough time for 2 years, well, can we use those 2 years to consolidate their competitive position, to improve the operations, to really grab the margin, so that when the sector does recover to some degree, you'll come out fighting and be a better business for it, and that in terms of that intervening time." So it's not some grand thesis. It's much more the opportunities are starting to come out now, where you are having to make more of a judgment call, and deals can't be presented in a plain vanilla fashion.
Yeah. Okay. And also on your values page, 2 of the 5, I think, are, they're not necessarily specifically or directly about investing, which I also think is different. You've got integrity and humility. I think you've already kind of touched on those themes before, but it seems like those types of factors and the way you do business is really important to you, in the same way as the way you then go about and think about investment opportunities. Is that fair?
That's right. So I always say to people, a lot of the time people say, "Oh, it's not personal, it's business." I'm like, no, business is personal. It's an aggregation of human actions. Someone's got to get out of bed that bit earlier, go push for that last piece of price, or go push that price point on what they're buying, take that red-eye flight to get to the States to close a deal, what have you. So it is about people and the culture and the rhythm that they have. And so how you conduct yourself and the way you do a deal, how you face off against management or the sell-side advisors or your own advisors, I think it's so important in terms of you treat them well and you treat them as you would like to be treated, which I know I've said a few times, but it's very much comes from that personal feeling of, okay, well, how would I feel if I did that to someone? And so we're always very conscious of, okay, if we're giving feedback, let's be straight. Let's be very mindful of how we're coming across. And in terms of, when you're conducting yourself in a diligence process, I've seen arrogance set in sometimes in my past context. Well, we're not masters of the universe. Guess what? Management are out there making it happen. You're just the investor trying to assess if it's going to continue to succeed and what you can do to it. So never assume you're any better than who you're in front of. So that's why I take to it. And that's what we mean by humility, among other things, is just we're all trying to do the best we can.
Yeah. Okay, so lots of deals obviously across your career, and actually you don't have to answer this by referencing a deal, but I do want to do highlights and lowlights. We've not covered that. So which do you want to do first? Do you want to do career lowlight or career highlight?
Okay, I'll do career lowlight, so it's really quick. I did a take private in 2015, and it was during August, which is the worst time to do a deal, by the way, especially a take private. And as a take private, I think what we often don't appreciate with the way public companies report is what you see is not what you get. And so it took a lot of working through, both in terms of numbers and people on that transaction. So I won't be rushing to do a big take private again anytime soon.
Okay, and so before we get to highlights, any particularly I don't mean to load the pressure on you here, but anything particularly funny or interesting that's come up on the deals along the way?
For me, I I love doing site visits. I love looking at factories. Call me sad, but that's where you really get the drumbeat of a business, certainly in the manufacturing space. But I've not always called it right. So one of my first site visits, it was a casting plant in the middle of nowhere, metal casting, and I showed up in heels, and the heels duly melted in the factory. And then I had to climb up various metal staircases sounding like Long John Silver for the rest of the site visit. And on one of the other ones was, because some of these sites are obviously in a very random place, and so there isn't always public transport, there is sometimes no taxis. And so in one, I literally had to get into a stranger's car and hitchhike my way to the factory. But I was assured by the hotel receptionist that however weird he looked, he was a good man. And so I did get into a pickup truck and prayed that I would come out the other side.
You were brought up in London, weren't you?
Yes.
Yeah, so you couldn't possibly fathom the idea. You'd go somewhere, there are no
randomly
taxis.
hitchhiking with someone in a pickup truck.
Yeah, where are the black cabbies?
Yeah, exactly.
And then highlights,
obviously doing Tracerco with Mayor Brown. So enjoyed that because it was our first international carve-out. We had some great people on the south side. We had great advisors. The team really pulled together. It was brilliant. We all pulled together because it was very complicated. And there's lots to think about and get through, and some new territory in terms of problem solving, which we had to do with the south side as well, in terms of, okay, I hadn't thought about this issue, now we need to fix it. So it was wonderful to see that come together. It was a lot of effort. A lovely team as well, the management team, Newcastle based and international as well, just really great people to deal with. So we're pretty excited. And so far so good. We closed it end of September, and it definitely had its twists and turns, but really pleased with that we're in it.
Yeah. Here. Okay, so that's highlights, lowlights. Before I ask you to write your rollover question for the next guest, the only other thing which I thought would be quite interesting to touch on was you perform a role as a governor on the board at St Paul's Girls' School, a school that you went to.
Yes.
Right. What do you, as somebody who sits professionally on boards for a living, what do you get out of that experience?
There are three things about that. One, it was the first board I'd ever been on where it was mainly women. And then seeing, certainly we have a high mistress, and we've had mainly high mistresses so far. Maybe one day we'll have a male head. But
what's a male version of a high mistress?
It's high master, which just sounds bizarre, but whatever. Yeah. And it's wonderful seeing the way that female leadership can be executed, and just seeing the style, and it's a very different style. And the way they lead their senior management teams is just inspiring. And the third is you're around incredibly bright people who are thinking about issues that are far away from the day-to-day. The evolution of education, how does digital influence the way we learn, so on and so forth. How do you create resilience so that our pupils can succeed in the wider world? Those are interesting issues in and of their own right.
Yeah.
I'm but a small piece of that puzzle in terms of I head up the more financial part of the equation, which makes me the boring numbers person. So I bring that discipline and oversight, but it's just fascinating to be around these people, these big brains.
But you're in all those meetings where they're discussing those.
I'm not on the education committee because I'm pretty sure they don't need to hear my views, but yeah. I get the report back because I sit on the broader governing body, and so we get the feedback on how the school's doing. We sit in on lessons from time to time. So it's just a really enriching experience. And also part of what we're pushing is having more bursary students, which I think is really important, making sure that education is accessible and that student body is more diversified.
And how does, because I guess the high mister point highlights in effect the reverse of what most corporate boards out there are trying to achieve right now in terms of achieving.
Yeah, we did have a moment where we're like, oh, we better have a diversity hire. Yeah. We should interview a man. Ooh, titter. It was, it's great to see, and again, it's just a different style of board. And it's always good to, private equity is often about taking best practices from very disparate places. So I've been in a firm, when I was at the RSC, we talked about using the same risk register approach as you do in a chemicals company. I've been on chemical boards where we said, okay, let's use the supply chain practices that you can get from automotive.
Yeah.
So it's that cross-pollination. I think, a school board is just one extra element in that regard. So I really enjoy it.
Great. Well, final bit. So this is your chance to write a question for guests.
Can I just say my handwriting's terrible?
That's fine. I'll be able to. So what happened this time was that somebody very helpfully took Richard's scribble and turned it into text. So I suspect that's going to happen again this time.
Well, I think we should. Yeah, I've got an idea. Because one thing, we need good anecdotes for this. So I'm going to.
Don't tell us.
I'm not going to tell you the question, but I'm helping your next one. Okay. Okay, there we go. Nice and short.
Thank you. Goes in there for episode 3. Zeina, thank you very much for joining me.
See you. Thanks.